What if the Knight was in Deltarune Chapter 2, Part 3? Now this should be the finale of Chapter 2, hopefully. But, other than that, where did we leave off? So, last time we left off, Queen had captured Chris and the rest of the gang, but she had left the Knight alone. Now, pretty much the reason why Queen captured all of the rest of the heroes and instead of the Knight was because no restraint could technically hold the Knight thanks to their Shade Cloak and to their abilities. Now, because of that, Queen thought the best possible way that her plans can succeed from now is if she were to capture the heroes and pretty much completely stall the Knight as long as possible. So Queen is going to have to harass the Knight as much as possible until her plans are ready. But other than that, we return to the Knight. Now, the Knight is standing alone outside of Queen's palace and wondering how are they going to rescue the heroes. Now, seeing the design of Queen's mansion, I could assume that there are multiple entry points where the Knight could break in. But, unfortunately for the Knight doesn't know where Queen is keeping our heroes, so the Knight is going to have to snoop around the palace. Now, here's how I think the Knight is going to break in. So, if you'd played Chapter 2, you'd obviously remember the acid tunnels. Now, the acid tunnels obviously have acid, and acid is a liquid. Now, the point I'm trying to get to that is, since there is a massive amount of acid in Queen's Palace, how did it get in there? Now, I am going to assume that there is either a aqueduct or some other pipeline that leads into Queen's Mansion to get the acid in and out. So let's say by a stroke of luck, the Knight would find a entry point into the pipelines. Now, if you'd played Hollow Knight, you'd remember that the Knight has one item that would help him, and that item is Isma's Tear. Now, Isma's Tear is pretty much gives the Knight immunity towards acid. Now, obviously the acid in the waterways and in Hollowness are very different types of acid the acid in Queen's Mansion, but it's never really specified the limitations of the Knight's immunity towards the acid. So let's just say that the Knight can just swim through any type of acid. So after some snooping around and a lot of trespassing, the Knight managed to sneak their way into the acid pipeline and eventually enter Queen's acid pool. Now, the Knight would, of course, try and get a sense of direction in the acid pool, but after enough swimming, the Knight would encounter Rose Card. Now, Rose would be rehearsing his ambush and pretty much his next confrontation against the heroes, but the Knight would, of course, stand there until Rose would see the Knight. Now, Rose wasn't expecting the Knight to encounter them so soon, let alone literally be swimming in acid. Now, Rose would pretty much give his villainous monologue, but knowing the situation the Knight is in, the Knight wouldn't really have time for Rose. So the Knight would attack Rose mid-dialogue and knocking Rose into the acid. Now, Rose would of course be burning in agony, so Rose would of course probably teleport out of there. And because of this, it pretty much prevents Rose from encountering Chris and Rose during when they had to go through the tunnel So thankfully that the Knight's action would allow Chris and Rose to completely skip that encounter. So pretty much, while the Knight is swimming through the tunnels, obviously things would go the same on the fun games side. So pretty much, Chris and the gang are pretty much having Birdie's character development, but so that's kind of what they are doing over there. But after finding the exit to the acid swimming pool, Queen would finally notice that the Knight somehow broken in. Now, Queen really not wanting the Knight to ruin her plans, Queen would alert all of her minions to find the Knight and capture them, and either pretty much do whatever. Now, I don't know what Queen would do if she would capture the Knight, but I would like to assume that she would probably just put him under lock and key and throw the key away somewhere. But besides that, Queen would see that the Knight somehow broken into her palace. And because of that, Queen would mostly focus all of her attention on the Knight, but she would also keep tabs on Chris and the others. So pretty much, the moment Queen would sound the alarm, almost every SWATling and any other servants of Queen would pretty much be heading directly in the Knight's direction, which is pretty much every direction. Now, here's what's going to happen. So, the Knight does not know where Chris and the others are at, and pretty much, I would assume by this point, Chris and the others have already escaped their holding rooms. So, pretty much, all the Knights could know is that probably Chris and the others are probably getting tortured for all that the Knight knows. So, because of that, the Knight is going to stop holding back. So, I would like to assume that almost throughout the entire adventure, the Knight has been putting effort in their fights, but they have also probably been sort of holding back. But seeing that the Knight is kind of on a time schedule, the Knight would begin fighting through Queen's minions like they're in the Trial of the Fool. So pretty much, this would be a good thing and also a bad thing. Now the good thing is, the noise and commotion of this would pretty much spread, well, the news in general of the Knight's rampage would spread through the palace. It would probably reach the fun gang. But the bad news is this would force Queen to put her plans ahead of schedule. So this means that they're going to have to rescue Noelle right now. So, but other than that, eventually the news of the Knight's rampage would reach Chris, Rose, and Susie, and probably Birdie. Now they would have to decide whether they want to find Noelle first or try and find the Knight. Now, knowing how the Knight can really well handle themselves, they decide that finding Noelle first would be the more important part. So while Chris and the others would try and find Noelle and also rescue her, the Knights would, of course, be fighting the gauntlets of Queen's Mansion. Now, Queen would, of course, be monitoring how the Knight fights and pretty much the Knight's actions in general, because if the scenario where Queen is going to have to actually face the Knights and the others directly, which is a very high probability, she is going to at least need something up her sleeve to try and level try to level the playing field to fight the Knight. Now, pretty much, the Knights would, of course, enter the dining hall and pretty much fight their way through it as well. Now, eventually, after a few and many turns, the Knights would re-encounter Rose and Susie, who are standing outside of a door. And now this is where I'm going to say that while the Knights was probably entering the mansion or, well, fighting through Queen's minions, Chris had taken that time to continue the Spamton side quest. Now, pretty much, I'm going to say that Chris has gotten the key gen by this point, and pretty much starting the final interaction with Spamton down in the basement. Now, pretty much, Rose and Susie would be happy to see the knight, but Rose wouldn't be too pleased on the knight's methods of trying to find them. But while the three were getting together again, they would hear the noise of swatchlings coming in their direction. Now, they would make the smart decision to go down into the basement to, well, not be seen by the horde of swatchlings and other minions that are being sent by Queen to find the group and the knight. Now, pretty much, while the three would make their way down into the basement, Spamton would be giving his monologue about how, in order to be big, Spamton is going to need Chris's soul. But before Spamton could do anything funny towards Chris, Susie would hit Spamton with a vicious Root Buster. After hitting Spamton with a Root Buster, Susie would go up to Chris to see if they're alright. Now, Susie would ask them who was that weirdo, but before Chris could answer, all three of them would be swept up by carts and be sent down a suspiciously long track. Now, the knights would of course be in Chris's cart, but they would be taken by another surprise, and that would be the floating hedge of Spamton. Now, luckily, the knight has Vengeful Spirits now. Now, Vengeful Spirits I'm going to say that it is strong enough to destroy the hedge, but Chris would still have their yellow soul. Now, Spamton would be surprised to see that not only one, but two big shots, and just like that, the Spamton Neo fight would begin. Now, Spamton Neo is pretty much like the Jubble fight. It's not mandatory, but it does have a good reward. But pretty much, this is the first major fight of this video, so just like every other major fight, we are going to have to compare the knights against Spamton. Now, pretty much, in order to defeat Spamton, you can either fight Spamton or just cut their strings. Now, I'm gonna say, due to the environment of the battlefield, I'm gonna say, unfortunately, the knight is going to have to go on the pacifist route, so they're all going to have to cut the strings off of Spamton. Now, remember way back in chapter 1 when I said that there was a reason why I gave Chris Mark of Pride? This fight would be that reason. Now, seeing that they are riding carts and they're above a very moving track, the knight cannot just go off the cart and just go up to Spamton. So, for this fight, the knight is going to have to rely on the teamwork with Chris, Susie, and Ralsei. So, pretty much, the knight does have Vengeful Spirits to destroy the Spamton hits, but unfortunately, the knight has to have soul to cast magic. So, and unfortunately, the knight doesn't really have Spell Twister, but the knight does also have the Shaman Stones and all the other magic charms if they want to go down the violent route. But just like I said, they are going to have to cut off the strings. Now, pretty much, Spamton has the environmental advantage because of the moving tracks, but mainly most of Spamton's attacks pretty much require the yellow soul, because there's the heart attack. Well, the heart attack. No, the pun not intended. But pretty much cutting the strings. Now, there is the Great Slash, which is, I think, one of the nail arts, but then again, I could be forgetting the name wrong. But yeah, that would be one thing that the knight can do against Spamton. Now, but yet again, thanks to, well, the fight really mainly taking place on tracks, and, well, I don't think that if the knight would land on the tracks would be a very good idea of fighting Spamton. But pretty much, the knight is just going to be a hit and dodge, and mostly dodging the entire fight. Now, there is also Giga Spamton, which is, I think, Spamton's final attack. But pretty much, from what I've seen, that's mostly just for show, and other than that, that's pretty much Spamton's final attack. Now, there is a whole lot of other attacks, but pretty much those attacks can be dealt with the Yellow Soul. So, but besides that, all the knight can really do in that fight is either just dodge Spamton's attacks, and occasionally hit Spamton with a spell, and just slash through Spamton's wires. But pretty much, the fun game is going to be mainly the leaders during that fight. So, in comparison, mainly just because of the environment, Spamton, Neo, and the Knight are kinda on equal ground. But without the environment, I'm sure the Knight could probably beat Spamton alone if it didn't really take place on moving tracks. But other than that, the fight would pretty much go how it would usually go, just with the inclusion of the Knight and their abilities. But eventually, with enough effort, the Knight and the Fun Gang would cut through pretty much all of Spamton's wire until Spamton only has one left. Now, pretty much the same thing would happen. They would all cut the last wire, and Spamton would collapse on the ground. Now, Spamton's dialogue would still be the same. So, Spamton would say how he just wanted to be free, and he would dissolve into the Deal Maker. After receiving the Deal Maker, they would all try to, well, they would all move to exit the basement. Now, right before they would exit the basement, Susie would stop all of them by asking, are they seriously not going to talk about what just happened? Now, Rouse would try to find a reason to why this happened, and Rouse would probably assume that Spamton was just a corrupted program. Now, Susie could see this, but Susie also has a feeling that that really might not be why it happened. But while Susie would think this, she would go over to Chris, and she would see that Chris has goosebumps. Now, she would ask Chris if they are okay. Now, Chris would say that they are okay, but their voice says otherwise. Now, pretty much, Susie would say that if something like this would probably happen again, it would be better if they would all handle it as a team next time. Now, the Knight wasn't really here for, well, the rest of the Spamton side quest because, well, they're moving through the palace, but pretty much this would only add more suspicion onto Chris towards the Knight. Now, the Knight doesn't mind helping Chris, but at the same time, it's kind of starting to get harder for the Knight to entirely trust Chris because of, well, things like this, and also, well, the last time. But other than that, the Knights would just focus on the goal, then, well, entirely think about this for right now. So they would all agree to work as a team for whatever comes next, and they would exit the basement. Now, as they would exit the basement, luckily, the search party for the night and for the fun gang would have left the area by that point. Now, they would all move to actually find Noel now. But after respecting some pottery and some organization, they would eventually reach Birdley. Now, Birdley would reveal a passageway that would lead towards Noel, but Birdley would say that it would probably be a better idea if some of them would distract Queen and the rest of them would go rescue Noel. Now, Birdley, Susie are a group of 2, but since they are going with Noel, that would make a group of 3. Now, since Chris and Ralsei are going to help distract Queen, that means I'm going to throw the night with Chris and Ralsei to make them a group of 3. Now, since they are going to distract Queen, and since the knights, rampage earlier, it would be a perfect distraction. Now, as Chris and Ralsei would enter the swimming pool of acid, they would get into the swan boats. But unfortunately, the swan boats only have room for 2. Now, Ralsei would suggest that maybe there is a bigger swan boat, but before Ralsei could say anything else, the knight would just jump in the acid, completely unharmed. Now, Ralsei would be surprised and also shocked by this, but after some time, Ralsei would see that the knight doesn't look like they're in pain, so Ralsei would be relieved. Now, pretty much how this section would go is Queen would, of course, be very distracted by this, and pretty much the knight would just be hanging on the back of the swan boat while Chris and Ralsei would have their character development. Now, since the knight has Isma's tear, Chris and Ralsei wouldn't really have to deal with the puzzles because the knight can just directly swim through the houses and pretty much just solve the puzzles themselves so they can continue on. Now, but besides that, Chris and Ralsei and the knight will just breeze past through the acid tunnel because the knight also dealt with Rose earlier, so Rose is kind of in no condition to at least try to have a boss battle against Chris and Ralsei and the knight. So because of that, the Rose encounter wouldn't really happen. Now, eventually, they would reach the end of the tunnel ride. Now, after Chris and Ralsei would get their photo, and the knight very barely in the photo, with just their horns in it, they would reach the end of the tunnel. And now they shall wait. And now they are waiting for Chris. No, now they are waiting for Susie and Birdley to come back with Noel. But pretty much, while the 3 are a man closing their eyes and the knight just looking down, they would just imagine what Susie is probably doing. Now, pretty much the same thing is going to happen as it does with, on Susie's side. Susie would be able to convince Noel that this is a dream, but when they're on the Ferris wheel, and thanks to last video, Noel would be kind of scared because now she's scared of heights now instead of mice. But pretty much she would be a bit calm because, Susie's here. But pretty much Susie and Noel would have their character development up until Birdley comes and ruins happens the moment while Noelle would choke Burley out. But eventually, Susie would return with, not with Noelle now, but pretty much Susie would rejoin the group while also landing on Ralsei in the process. But other than that, they can now go and confront Queen after, as they would fight through Queen's minions, pretty much the last of Queen's minions, and they would eventually reach Queen. Now, Queen would be there waiting for them. Now, Queen would give her monologue about it, with Noelle now in her possession. It's only a matter of time before Noelle's will would eventually align with Queen's, but Susie would say that they have rescued Noelle and there's no chance of Queen winning now. But Queen would reveal that after Susie left Noelle with Burley, she had sent some of her minions to capture Burley and reclaim Noelle. Now, as Queen would reveal this, Burley would descend down from the ceiling, I would assume, now being controlled by a wire. Now pretty much Queen would give our heroes one last chance to surrender and or join her or pretty much be enslaved by her. But of course our heroes would oppose Queen, and now because of that, the battle against Queen would begin. Now, this is technically the final boss, but like I said, technically it is, but besides that, in order to defeat Queen, Queen has Burley under her control, and she also has a shield. So, how I see this fight going is pretty much they need to fight, they need to disable Queen's shield, but they also need to free Burley. So Chris with Mark of Pride would mainly deal with Burley, while Susie and the Knight would try to defeat Queen. Now, Ralsei would hang back with their magic, and pretty much they shall just pretty much be magical support for our heroes. Now, luckily, this is pretty much why I gave them charms, because not only just for plot convenience, but also to give them more of an edge to certain fights like this one. Now, pretty much, I don't think that they would be very pacifistic in this fight, mainly, but pretty much, once they would disable Queen's shield, Susie with heavy blow, not heavy blow, Susie with unbreakable strength, and the Knight with whatever charm would fit them for this battle, would pretty much unleash all their strength upon Queen. Now, Queen, seeing how the Knight has fought their way through her palace, she would pretty much try to predict the Knight's movement as best as possible. So some of the Knight's attacks would land on her and some won't, but other than that, Queen would be overwhelmed until her shield would return. Now, with Mark of Pride and Chris would be trying to loosen the wire, but since the wire isn't willingly going to come off, Chris decides that the best way to free Burley is to cut the wire off. Now, eventually Queen's shield would be growing, so in order for them to properly disable it without actually, they're not going to need a toast. The Knight is just going to bypass the shield, with Susie trying to break through it as well. So pretty much, the Knight is going to be harassing Queen, while Susie is going to be behind the knight supporting them. So how the fight would pretty much go is while Queen is throwing all of her attacks and Chris freeing Birdly, they're just going to pretty much brute force their way through this fight. Now Queen, seeing that Chris eventually freed Birdly and now she is significantly outnumbered, Queen would pull one final trick to escape our heroes, and that is the oldest trick in the book, which is making them look in the other direction. Now, this trick would work with every hero except the knight. So as Queen would make her escape, the knight would be right on her tail. Now, the rest of the heroes would be making sure Birdly is okay, but with Birdly trying to get Susie to fall in love with him, which wouldn't work, but pretty much Birdly would just tell them to go after Queen. Now, all of our heroes would eventually catch up to the knight, and they would all eventually catch up to Queen. Would find Queen overlooking the city. Now, Queen would explain about the knight and how the knight had cursed their will into their blackened blade. Now, pretty much, and how the knight managed to create this world. But unfortunately, Cyberworld is locked in and only trapped in the confines of the library. Now, she would say that if one was determined enough, they could create more dark fountains, and eventually they could cover the whole world. Now, Queen would finish her monologue, and she would ask Noelle how that would sound. But before Queen could say anything further, Susie would hit Queen with a root buster and pretty much free Noelle. Now, Noelle would be happy, but she would warn that Queen has something much bigger. And before they could do anything else, Queen would reappear with a giant robot of herself. Now, Noelle would say that they cannot defeat Queen like this, but the knight is not backing down because the knight has fought things bigger than him before. So the knight would strike the challenge pose, but before the knight could do anything else, Queen would flick the knight right off the roof of her palace, and probably would either break 3 masks. Now, as the rest of the heroes would watch the knight fall, they would turn back to say that Queen will not get away with this. But unfortunately, Queen would do the same thing to them and knock them off of the platform on the palace. So pretty much, now all 4 of them are pretty much falling to their death. Now, as they were trying to figure out how they're going to get out of the situation, all 4 of them would be saved by Birdly and his flying cart. Now, Birdly would reveal that if they were to combine their powers, they can defeat Queen, and the rest of the heroes would see multiple other Darkners and citizens of Cyber City. Now, here's the thing, right? Half of the Darkners are willing to stand up against Queen because they don't like the rule. And then there's the other half who decides that it's better, if they cannot beat our heroes, they might as well join them because it's better to stand up against Queen than, well, stand up against the heroes and especially the knights. So they would side with our heroes. Now, luckily, Roll's card is also here because, well, same reason with other half, can't beat them, join them, but so Rose is now completely covered in bandages, but other than that, Rose also has brought the trash machine with him. Now, because of this, everyone would combine their powers into one, and they would form the Ultimate School Project. Now, what powers would the knights give the project? Now, with some thinking, I have decided to give the project the Knight's Shade ability. So, with powers combined, they would form the Roaring Chorus. Now, pretty much, Queen will be waiting in the middle of the city for our heroes for the very final confrontation. Now, pretty much, this battle will just be like the arcade machine, but with giant robots this time, and action wheel. So pretty much, the two Colossus would engage in a hand-to-hand combat, but of course, Queen is not one for honest fights. So she would throw in a lot of curveballs, but thanks to the Knight's Shade Dash, our heroes would be able to use the Knight's Shade abilities to dodge Queen's tricks. So pretty much, Queen can only resort to hand-to-hand combat against our heroes. Now, so pretty much, after a long and decent epic fight, Queen would begin to lose, and as in a very last-ditch effort, she would jump in the air and reveal that she has detachable hands. And because of that, she would defeat the Roaring Chorus and capture all four of our heroes. So after a bit, Queen would return to Noelle. Queen would be holding all four of our heroes in her gigantic palm. Now, Queen, with the last bit of energy that she has in her mech, she would instruct Noelle to take the pin that Queen has given her and to strike the earth. Now, Noelle would be hesitant, but after the entire time and through this entire adventure, she finally builds up the courage to stand up to Queen. Now, Noelle would tell Queen to leave her friends alone and would tell Queen that all of this is not making her happy, and especially right now, it's not really working. Now, after Noelle would stand up against Queen, well, vocally against Queen, Queen would take a moment and she would smile. Now, she would explain that all she wanted to do is to make Noelle happy. Now, pretty much, Queen would just tell Noelle that with the power she has, choose the world and create the world that she would want. And make the world that would make her happy. And with that, Queen would shut down. So pretty much, as Queen was shut down, Noelle would contemplate the words that Queen had told her. Now, Noelle didn't want to live in a world that was ruled by Queen, but if that wasn't the case, would this world be really bad, or would it be better? But Noelle would ask Susie this too. Now, the conversation would go the same, but eventually Birdly would return. Now, how did Birdly escape the battle between the Chorus and Giga Queen? I don't know, but Birdly is here. Now, Birdly would say that he can assist in creating this world that Noelle and Susie wants. Now, pretty much, Birdly would raise his halberd and say with his power, he shall create a new world. But before Birdly could do this, Roche would stop him mid-track. Now, Birdly would say that he was just trying to help, and Birdly would try again, but Roche would shout to stop. Now, Roche would explain why this would be a bad idea, because Roche would pretty much explain the roaring. Now, the roaring is pretty much when the balance between the light and the dark is broken, and pretty much mainly happens when the balance between the light and the dark is broken, and when there's too many dark fountains, it would practically lead to the apocalypse. So, Rosie would ask, is that their idea of paradise? And now, Queen had a backup power, and she would say, well, she didn't know that. Now, they would all be surprised that Queen didn't notice, and they would ask, isn't that what you wanted? Now, Queen would reveal that the entire time she was just going off of complete assumption and theory, and pretty much she was going off of basically what the knight has done. Now, with all of that, Queen would release our heroes and she would return. As Queen is exiting her mech, it will just leave our heroes and Noelle and Berkeley. So pretty much the same thing would happen as it really does. Noelle and Susie would pretty much have the same conversation, and Susie would say that Noelle's dream is going to end soon, and she would also tell Noelle that she does not have a tail. Then, as they would continue on, Queen would run her goodbye.exe, or I think that's what it's called, but anyway, she would be thanking our heroes for everything that they've done, even though Queen has not been a help. But anyways, Queen will remember them for their unneeded honesty, their fullest bravery, and their chill vibes. And Queen would also remember the knight for their primal aggression. Now, Rose would say that this doesn't have to be a goodbye because they can all just bring them to Castletown. Now, Queen hearing this, she would be like, oh, really cool. So she would just cancel the program, and she would allow our heroes to seal the Dark Fountain. But before our heroes would seal the Dark Fountain, the knight would go up to them, and the knight would take back the charms that the knight has given them at the beginning of this adventure. Now, once their charms were removed, they would feel like their normal selves. So Susie would feel less stronger. Chris's sword would be returned to a normal broadsword, and Rose's magic would return to the normal price, the normal amount of TP that they needed to cast. So pretty much, once the knights would retake their charms, Susie would say, well, it was good while it lasted, I guess. But after that, Rose would hang back while Chris, Susie, and the knights would go up to the fountain to seal it. Now, just like before, Chris would go up to the fountain, and with the power of their soul, they would seal the Dark Fountain. And with their bright flash of light, the library was just as normal. So all three of them would stand there while they would see Noelle and Bertley face down on the computers. Well, not on the computers, but on the computer desks. After a bit, Noelle and Bertley would regain their consciousness, and now, after looking around for a bit, Noelle would realize that this could have actually been a dream. Now, even though none of it was a dream, but thanks to Susie, Noelle would actually believe it was a dream. Now, Bertley would also believe it was a dream, and they would see Chris, Susie, and the knight. Now, Bertley would ask what are they doing here, but Noelle would say that she invited Chris and Susie to study together while the knight would probably hang around with them. Now, Bertley would be opposed to this, but after everything, I guess after the dream, Bertley would say, we could try it, but unfortunately, they would realize that the day is about to end. Now, unfortunate, and because of that, Noelle and Bertley would, of course, exit the computer lab and go to wherever they need. So, after all of that, Susie would take a minute and she would realize that they practically just saved the world. But she would also realize that nobody knows that, so pretty much they figured that the next best course of action would be to return to Castletown. Now, they would exit the library and they would pretty much go around hometown, either interacting with the people there or just looking around in general. But after all the interactions, they would eventually make it to the school and they would enter the closet and they would jump down into Castletown. Now, as they would enter Castletown, the glimmer of light would come off Chris, which would signify that Queen is now in Castletown. But there would be a second glimmer of light, and that glimmer of light would come off of the knight. Now, they wouldn't notice the second one, or maybe they would also look over Queen as well. But once they would land in the entrance of Castletown, they would be greeted by Queen. Now, Queen would look around in this new dark world, and she would tell them that this place seems cool enough. So as they would all venture further into Castletown, they would be greeted by a second figure, and the knight would stop dead in their tracks because they are seeing a ghost of their past, and that ghost is the Pale King. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why is the Pale King here? Because doesn't this video say, what if the knight was in well, not in Hollow Knight, what if the knight was in Deltarune? Now, here's the thing, right? Now, from my understanding of the Dark World, and mainly from Rossi's explanation, and from some of the lore of Hollow Knight, I decided that this is where I could be able to intertwine the lore of Hollow Knight and Deltarune together, because that is also a goal of this what if. Now, the second thing is, how did the Pale King get here? So, from my understanding of the Dark Worlds is, when an item enters a Dark World from the Light World, that item would of course become their own being. Now, the reason if you don't know the lore of Hollow Knight, which I'm assuming some of you do not, the Pale King is technically not alive. Now, how did the Pale King die? Well, that is still kind of a mystery on my knowledge. Some people assume that the Pale King withered away along with his powers, and others believe that the Pale King was consumed by the void and by his own actions. But whatever the case, the Pale King is in the state that they are. So pretty much because of that, that still technically doesn't answer the question of how the Pale King is here. Now, if you play Hollow Knight, there is a certain charm, and that charm is called King Soul. Now, the King Soul is a charm that needs to be assembled, unlike every other charm that you come across. Now, there are other certain charms that can be upgraded, but the King Soul is one of the real important charms if you're going for a specific ending. But the King Soul was created by the White Lady and also by the Pale King, because the King Soul represents the union of the two. In other words, it's a magical wedding ring with a few extra steps. Now, the King Soul is, of course, has a part of the Pale King and also has his soul in it. Now, pretty much, if you'd seen the knight's charm inventory, you'd obviously see that the King Soul is missing. Well, if you take a closer look at the Void Heart, you can see that is the King Soul. Just the Void Heart is a upgraded version of the King Soul, and it's pretty much the knights rejecting the Pale King's will. Now, So I'm going to stretch the lore of both deltarune and hollow knight by saying that even though the knights and most of their items and all of their charms are practically immune to the influence of the dark world by some unknown force, I'm going to say that since the Void Heart is pretty much rejecting the Pale King's will, I believe that the dark world would be able to gain its grasp around the Pale King's soul, and well, mainly all the Pale King parts of the Void Heart, therefore resurrecting him. Now, the thing about the Pale King is, from my understanding and re-educating myself about him, is that the Pale King is a higher being. And to explain that for the non-Hollow Knight people, a higher being is a god, just in all lowercase, sometimes with a capital G, but most of the time they're all in lowercase. But pretty much the Pale King is a higher being, but since they are in the Dark World, most of his godlike abilities have been stripped away, but he's still not completely powerless. So, in case if any in the future chapters we are going to see combat either in Castletown, we're going to say that the Pale King would have most of the Pure Vessel's abilities and also Monarch Wings. But other than that, that's pretty much all the power that the Pale King has. Now, besides the Pale King's powers, who is the Pale King? Now, from my understanding and from everything that I gathered, the Pale King is pretty much in the morally gray area. The Pale King started out as a good person, but when the Radiance started returning and that whole scenario, that's when I believe the Pale King started to go way downhill. So other than that, the Pale King in this what if would be in a gray area in this what if. But other than that, they would see the Pale King. Now, the Pale King is also the creator of the vessels, which, if you know how that went, you'd obviously know that the Knight isn't really on good terms with the Pale King. And I don't think the Pale King would even know who the Knight is. Maybe they would, except for them being a vessel. Now, Chris and Susie would be surprised as well to see the Pale King, but they wouldn't be as surprised as the Knight. Now, Susie would ask who the Pale King is, but the Pale King would also ask a similar question by saying, what are you, and also wondering where he is. Now, pretty much the conversation between the Delta Warriors and also the Pale King would just be a conversation of complete confusion. Now, eventually, Rouse would come into the picture. Now, Rouse would return to greet our heroes on the return to Castletown and to also get Queen and all of her Darkeners that came over from Cyberworld. But Rouse would also be surprised to see the Pale King because Rouse never really encountered the Pale King throughout Cyberworld, but Rouse would just come to the conclusion that that's where the Pale King probably came from. Now, the Pale King would be hearing all of this, but all of this would just add to the Pale King's confusion, where he would just say, "Can anyone just explain what's going on?" Now, Rouse would ask the Pale King what he is confused about. Now, the Pale King would tell Rouse about everything he's confused by. So, pretty much, Rouse would ask, "Is the Pale King a lightener?" And the Pale King would ask, "What is a lightener anyways?" So, Rouse will just go to our heroes for some sort of explanation. Now, Susie and Chris would have no idea and pretty much have no answer for Ralsei, but Ralsei would see that the knight does know something about the Pale King. But unfortunately, just like other times, the knight was unable to precisely communicate this with Ralsei. Now, the one familiar sight that the king would see is, of course, the knight. Now, the knight would see the knight and would think, since there is a vessel here, then that means he must be somewhere, either near Hollowness or somewhere in the world of Hollow Knight. So the Pale King would ask if anyone knows about Hollowness, and they would all in unison would say no. Now, pretty much the Pale King would, well, not the Pale King, so Ralsei would, seeing that the Pale King doesn't know anything about the Dark World, or anybody knowing anything about the Pale King except the knight's physical expressions, would mean that Ralsei would decide to take Queen and King to his castle so he can figure it out. So pretty much because of this, Ralsei wouldn't really be able to join our heroes in Castletown for the aftermath of Chapter 2. So after Ralsei would take Queen and King away, Chris and Susie and the knight would be left to themselves. Now, Susie would ask the knight about the Pale King and if they're okay, because they didn't seem visibly, well, physically and visibly okay about the Pale King. Now, the knight would try to express their concerns as best as they could, but just like always, it wouldn't really land. So after all of that, they decide to take the confusion off and, well, that whole scenario away by adventuring through Castletown. Now, pretty much they would not go back to Ralsei's castle because they believe that Ralsei would figure it out himself, so they would just venture around the town. Now, they would do all of the post Chapter 2 interactions, well, the post-adventure interactions, I should say, but we're going to cover Sean's, the Shadow Crystal interaction. So pretty much, they would all return to Sean's shop. Now, Sean would greet our heroes, but he would see that the prince is not with them. So he would ask our heroes about it. Now, they would tell Sean that Ralsei is dealing with something important, so he couldn't be with them. Now, Sean would understand this, and he would ask, what can he do for our heroes? So they would probably buy more items, but they would give Sean another Shadow Crystal. Now, Sean would be surprised that they came across a second one so soon, and wonder how our heroes came across it. Now, they would tell Sean about the whole Spountain arc and pretty much how that whole fight went. Now, Sean would give his usual dialogue about this, and besides that, he would add it to the Shadow Crystal collection. Now, Sean would warn our heroes about what might happen with the next secret boss, but other than that, he would wish our heroes luck. So, as our heroes would leave Sean's shop and adventure through Castletown, we will return with Ralsei. Now, Ralsei would send Queen on her way into the castle, while Ralsei is now left with the Pale King. Now, Ralsei would ask about what does the Pale King know. Now, the thing about the Pale King is I don't think that he would be too open about his knowledge. So, if Ralsei wants anything about Hollowness, Ralsei would only gain either very vague details about it, or just any part of the Pale King that the Pale King feels comfortable about revealing. Other than that, Ralsei would ask about what does he know about the Dark Worlds. Now, obviously, the Pale King would know nothing about it. Now, Rose would ask him about the Light World, but the Pale King would just say that he is the eternal monarch of Hollowknight, and also he would also tell Rose about him being a higher being. Now, Rose would receive all of the information about the king, well, any information that the king would feel comfortable about receiving. But then the Pale King would reach a mind block, because the Pale King would try to search through his memories, but he feels like there's something missing. But so pretty much the Pale King would reveal that he knows there's more information, just he can't remember it. Now, Rose, knowing that Chris and Susie and the Knight brought Queen and everybody with them, but not the Pale King, and knowing that the Pale King knows that they are not a Darkener, is also adds to the confusion. Now, Rose would think for a minute, then Rose would come to a realization that the Pale King might be a certain type of Darkener, but he isn't completely sure about it. Now, Rose would ask if the Pale King possibly have, well, maybe Paris, but the Pale King would obviously say that if he would have Paris, he wouldn't have been here. Now, Rose would realize that that question would could have been asked better, so Rose would apologize. So Rose would say that until he can figure out a way to help the Pale King and possibly, well, help him go home, he is more than welcome to stay here. Now, the Pale King obviously not wanting to not be in Hollowknight, because I'm going to say that the Pale King doesn't know the current state of Hollowknight, which is, well, not good. So the Pale King would be skeptical about everything, but seeing Rose's kindness and also nice hosting, the Pale King would very cautiously accept, but the Pale King would still be on edge. So just like that, the Pale King is now in Castletown. But after all of that, Chris, Susie, and the Knight would eventually decide to go back to Chris's house. Now, since they returned to Chris's house, Susie would say that she would catch it too later, but right before Susie leaves, Toriel would open the door for our heroes. Now, Susie would welcome Chris and the Knight back, but she would see that Susie is with them. Now, Toriel, pretty much everything would go the same. So, Toriel would ask Chris if Susie is Chris's friend, and she would invite all three of them in. So, as Chris and Susie would do exactly what they did in Chapter 2, Toriel would tell the Knight that she was unable to find anyone that knows the Knight. So, until then, she tells the Knight that they are welcome to stay with her and Chris as long as they want, until she finds the Knight's family, or at least someone who claims to be the guardian of the Knight. But other than that, Susie and Toriel would of course be in the kitchen. Chris is doing exactly what they did in the ending of Chapter 2, and the Knight is just wondering, would just reflect on everything that just happened in Cyberworld, but mostly reflects on how the Pale King suddenly appeared. But as they reflect on this, they would feel that one of their charms is feeling different, and that is the Void Heart. But after everything, the Knights would go just as usual. So Toriel would of course see that her tires have been slashed, and she would call the police. But as Toriel would call the police, The knights would of course go outside and investigate, and they would see that the tires have been slashed by someone, but they do not know who. So so the knights would return to the house and they would see Chris is making a dark fountain. Now the knight, knowing Rose's explanation, would try to stop Chris, but before they could, it's already too late. So the dark fountain has been created and everyone inside of the house would be swallowed by the darkness. And just like that, that is the ending of chapter 2. Now, I know my Pale King explanation may have been very shaky, but just like I said, I am working with the information that I have tried to relearn, but then again, it's been a while since I delved into the Pale King. But other than that, this is what I would think would happen if the knight was in deltarune chapter 2. And just like that, I shall say again, I do not own deltarune or hollowknight because they belong to their respective creators, and if you like this video, you are more than welcome to like and subscribe. But other than that, this video is Captain Bones approved. And also, happy deltarune chapter 5.